Elizabeth at Literary Princess, and today I have another What Did I Read in My English Literature PhD video for you. So today we will be talking about my Victorian Gothic course, which was one of my favorite courses. I took this course in the spring of 2020, so halfway through the pandemic hit and we had to move on to Zoom, which sucked, but other than that, it was such a fantastic class, and I'm so excited to talk to you about it today. So, let's jump in. So even though it was called Victorian Gothic, we did actually read some things that were not Victorian. We started with an 18th century Gothic novel, and we also read some American works and some French works, which are technically not considered Victorian because they were not written in England. But most of it was Victorian, most of it was 19th century, and the 18th century text that we read is important for providing the groundwork of Gothic. So, the professor kind of broke this into three sections, and the first was Big House Gothic, which is kind of the most traditional form of the Gothic genre. And we started with the Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. So this is the 18th century novel. It was published in 1794, according to the back. I was going to say 1795, so I was very close. Anne Radcliffe is kind of one of the founders of the Gothic genre. It was considered to be created by Horace Walpole with the Castle of Otranto, but Anne Radcliffe was one of the biggest Gothic writers of the time. She was the biggest female Gothic writer of the time. She is parodied in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, specifically for Udolpho. That's what Catherine Morland, the main character of Northanger, is reading. So this follows a girl named Emily, whose parents die, and she ends up having to go live with her aunt. But her aunt is married to this very villainous man called Count Montini, I believe. Is it gonna say on the back? Yes. Montoni, excuse me. And she gets taken to his castle, Udolpho, where lots of creepy things start happening. So, I had never read Radcliffe before, and this actually remains the only book I've read by her, although I do have the Italian, which I want to read soon. I did really like this, however, it is very slow. It's very long. We don't get to Udolpho until, like, pretty far in. Like a few hundred pages, I think it was, before we were actually at Udolpho. So it takes patience, but I think it was pretty worth it in the end. And it was a great way to kick off this course, to lay the foundation for the Gothic genre before we got into later Gothic books. I also do want to briefly talk about some of the secondary sources we read. Not all of them, because a lot of them were just articles, but we did read significant chunks of several books. And the first was The Poetics of Space, the classic look at how we experience intimate places by Gaston Bachelard. So because we're talking about Gothic, we were talking a lot about space and architecture, and how do people move through space, how does the space function. That was the whole focus of the class. So all of these secondary readings are about that. I used The Poetics of Space in my paper that I will talk about momentarily, or one of my papers. We had 3 papers. I will talk about them all at the end. Also did quite a bit of reading from Grant Hildebrand's The Origins of Architectural Pleasure. And honestly, I wish I remembered these secondary sources more. The only one I really remember is the Bachelard one because I used it. I feel like I used the Hildebrand one too, but just not as much. So, sorry. The next book we moved on to is an absolute favorite of mine. I have read it so many times. Jane Eyre. I feel like I've talked about Jane Eyre so much on this channel because it is a favorite and because I did teach it in my British literature class. So Jane Eyre is just great. If you don't know, it's the story of Jane Eyre, who becomes a governess at a place called Thornfield Hall, where there is some really creepy stuff happening. And she falls in love with the owner of the house, Mr. Rochester. But again, there's this creepy stuff happening and it causes some issues. Really, this is a coming of age story for Jane. We follow her from the time she is 10 until she gets married. And it's really the middle part that is the Gothic part of this. And I mean, it has had such a big impact on the Gothic genre. So many books have been inspired by Jane Eyre, including Daphne du Maurier's very famous Rebecca. So, of course we had to read Jane Eyre. And of course I loved it because I already loved it. And another secondary source that we read was pieces of The Eyes of the Skin by somebody whose name I am going to mess up. One moment. Juhani Pallasmaa? Pallasmaa? There will be a picture here and you can see how it's spelled. And yeah. I don't remember this at all, so yay. Sorry. At least we're going a little bit better than the post-colonial video because I like barely remembered any of the primary sources from that one. And then we read some short stories from an author who is actually American, but he is, again, so important in the Gothic genre. We read several stories by Edgar Allan Poe. We did The Fall of the House of Usher, The Cask of Amontillado, The Pit and the Pendulum, and The Mask of the Red Death. I had read all of these before in other college courses and in high school. This is actually my high school copy of The Gold Bug and Other Tales. It has all of those stories that I just mentioned, in addition to many others, including the title story, The Gold Bug, which I found boring as all hell, but hey. So again, I really enjoyed these. I like Edgar Allan Poe a lot, specifically focusing in on the way space and architecture in these stories works was so fascinating because in all four of them, there are these really interesting architectural choices. I mean, The Fall of the House of Usher. And also the way that the house in The Mask of the Red Death is set up, very interesting. So we had some great discussion about these. So even though it's technically not Victorian because it's American, I'm really glad that my professor included this. And then we had another one that is not technically Victorian because it is French. This is The Phantom of the Opera. Again, another really classic piece of Gothic literature. The author is Gaston Leroux. And again, this is also a piece of early detective fiction, which is so interesting. We read several detective stories in this class because there is overlap of the detective genre and the Gothic genre, so that is very interesting. So even though this doesn't take place in a house, it takes place in an opera house. Our professor still included this in the big house genre because the opera house acts as the traditional Gothic castle or manor would. So this is the story of Christine Daae, a young soprano at the opera who suddenly gets very good and gets thrown into some leading roles because she has been training with a mysterious teacher who it turns out is the infamous opera ghost, who is just kind of a menace, to be perfectly honest. This is, of course, the basis for the very famous Andrew Lloyd Webber musical. It's a very different book than the musical. I had read this in high school after seeing the 2004 or 2005 film adaptation of the musical, and I was surprised at how different this is. It is a lot less romantic and a lot just more disturbing. There is some real disturbing stuff in here. The Phantom is very toned down in the musical, and here he is just absolutely unhinged. I had a great time rereading this. It is fun. It's not my favorite book in the world, but it is a good time. Then moved on to our next section, which was urban Gothic. And to kick this off, we did several Sherlock Holmes stories, and I think this is the second Sherlock Holmes novel, or the third, I don't remember. This is The Sign of Four. I'm gonna be honest, I have read this book multiple times, and every single time I completely forget what happens in it. I know that in this book, they are working on a case for the woman that does become Watson's wife. Let's see if anything on the back helps me. Yes, Mary Morstan. Her father vanished, and she began receiving large pearls as a gift every year. And now she has been invited to meet her unknown benefactor, and she wants Holmes and Watson to accompany her. So this is set in the city. I don't remember much else about it, though. I'm gonna be honest. I've read it so many times, too. Like, you'd think that but no. We also read a few of the Sherlock Holmes short stories. We did The Man with the Twisted Lip, The Blue Carbuncle, The Copper Beeches, and A Scandal in Bohemia. My favorite of these is A Scandal in Bohemia because it has Irene Adler, the woman who outsmarts Sherlock Holmes. Love her. She's from New Jersey. That's canon. She's from New Jersey. Which I feel like is a missed opportunity in every single adaptation of Sherlock Holmes ever. She should have a Jersey accent. Anyway, I'd read these all before. I had a great time with them. So another important secondary source that we read here was Walter Benjamin's The Arcades Project. And again, I don't remember a lot about this. I believe he is writing about the arcades in Paris, if I remember correctly. But this was kind of our main secondary source for the urban section of the class. Next up, we read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. So I had read this before as well. I had read a lot of these before, as you are hearing. Of course, another classic of the Gothic genre, much later than, say, Jane Eyre. So that's also something very interesting, is we jumped from, like, we had late 18th century with Udolpho, we had kind of mid-Victorian for Jane Eyre, and then we jump into the late 1880s and the 1890s for all of the last books, which is very fascinating, but that is kind of how the popularity of the Gothic genre worked. It kind of fell out of favor for a while. You would see aspects of it in other things, like sensation fiction, but then it became big again at the end of the century. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is again another kind of detective story. The main character is trying to figure out what is going on with this Mr. Hyde guy. How is Dr. Jekyll involved in it? It turns out they are the same person, and that Dr. Jekyll has been involved in an experiment that has not gone particularly right. I wrote a paper on this, which we will talk about. We had a pretty good time with this. We talked about it in connection with the Jack the Ripper case, which happened shortly after, to the point where there were some people that were like, he must be Jack the Ripper. So, and we talked here a lot about the danger of the city and how crime was portrayed in books in the city, but also just how it actually happened in the city. The Victorian city was just not a really safe place, you know. That ended our urban Gothic section, and we moved into the final section of the class, tourist Gothic. And for this, we started out with more Sherlock Holmes, The Hound of the Baskervilles. This is my favorite Sherlock Holmes story, okay? This is top tier. Like, the others they're fine. This is fantastic. Holmes and Watson are called out to this remote house of the Baskervilles on the moors because this dog, basically, of a legend of the families has kind of shown up, and somebody in the family has died, and it seems like it might be connected. This is so good. I love this book so much. I had read it before, again, and I just had so much fun revisiting it in this idea of tourist Gothic, because they are going to these moors that, like, they're not in a different country. We're still in England, but it is kind of foreign to what they're used to in the city. So that was a really interesting way of looking at it. We also did read 2 other short stories, The Musgrave Ritual and The Sussex Vampire. Next up, we moved into Dracula. You're noticing we're hitting like all those big kind of monsters. I'm surprised we didn't do Frankenstein, but I mean, that's not Victorian either. Not that Udolpho is, but we hit all the major universal monsters except for Frankenstein that come from literature. Dracula follows Jonathan Harker as he goes to Transylvania to complete this basically real estate deal with Count Dracula, and things go horribly, terribly wrong because Count Dracula is a vampire, as we now all know. So what's interesting, I had not read this before, actually, but I actually didn't really like it the first time I read it. I was heavily skimming this time. I mean, by now we were full pandemic mode. I was living at my in-laws. There was a tragedy in my family. I was just not doing well at this point. So I really kind of checked out for the last bit of this class. So I revisited Dracula a few years ago to read for my exams, and I loved it. It was so good. So I wish I had had a better experience with it the first time I read it. Like, there were parts that I liked, but there were also parts that I found boring. My second time reading it, no, I loved it. This was great. Oh, and it looks like I'm wrong. There were 4 sections of this class. So after Tourist Gothic, we moved into Imperial Gothic, which was kind of considered a subset of Tourist Gothic, if I remember correctly, because they were lumped together for the paper on those. So the first one we read here was King Solomon's Mines by H. Rider Haggard. Again, I was checked out by this point. I didn't enjoy this. I don't really remember much of it. It's an adventure book. What's it say on the back? It is set in Africa. A group of people is going to find one of the other's younger brother who's disappeared while looking for the legendary diamond mines of King Solomon. And things go horribly, terribly wrong. I can just say that for every single book here. Things go bad. Again, I don't remember much about this. I didn't really like it, but I was heavily skimming by that point. Sorry. And then we ended with Joseph Conrad's The Heart of Darkness. This was my second time reading this book. I hate this book. Do not like it at all. So again, I was pretty checked out by this point. What's interesting is I feel like we don't usually think of Heart of Darkness as a Gothic novel, and our professor actually said that. But when you look at like what does a Gothic novel contain and you look at what's in Heart of Darkness, yeah, it is kind of Gothic. And this idea of it being Imperial Gothic was actually very interesting to me because I had written for my post-colonial class the paper on Rudyard Kipling's Imperial Gothic short stories. So I will say that it was a very interesting way of looking at this book, but I still hate this book. So instead of having one big seminar paper or like a midterm paper and a final paper, we had 3 shorter papers, and they were on specific prompts. So the first one was called the Ferndean paper, and it was on Jane Eyre. And we were specifically looking at the space of Ferndean and using some of these secondary sources, the Hildebrand or the Bachelard or the Pallasmaa, to read the architecture and the setup of Ferndean and decide, is this a happy ending or is this not a happy ending? So I ultimately argued that it is not a happy ending because of the way that the house is structured and the way it is situated in a wood. I used Hildebrand's theory about kind of drawers and closets, which is that they're used to, and boxes, which is they're used to hide things. So you have a box and you put some stuff in it, and if you want something to not be found, you put it in another box within the box, and then the other things in the box you have kind of like maybe kind of eye-catching so that other people will just take that and not pay attention to the smaller box within the box. So I argued that Jane, as the narrator, actually sets up Ferndean kind of as this box. And I would actually say that now, looking back on it and having reread the book like another 5 times, not another 5 times, but a few more times, that she actually kind of sets up the whole novel that way, of being like, hey, look over here at this thing, and then hiding away the actual important part. Which is something that Charlotte Bronte also does with Villette to even more effect, I think, because Lucy Snow is a far more secretive narrator than Jane Eyre. But Jane Eyre is pretty secretive too. So that was my argument for this. And that she's actually kind of trying to hide the fact that she does not gain that independence and freedom she wanted through her marriage with Rochester. She basically just becomes another angel in the house caretaker figure. In order to keep us from seeing that, she shuts us out. She doesn't allow us many interior scenes of Ferndean. So that was my argument with that paper. The second paper was the Urban Gothic paper, and we were asked to analyze the role of motion in Conan Doyle or Stevenson. How does the ease or difficulty of motion through the city demonstrate power? So I wrote on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and I was examining women in motion in this book because all the main characters are men. At first there seems like there's no women in this book at all, but there actually are. There are a few background characters. There is a little girl who is running through the city to get a doctor, and Mr. Hyde just like runs over her, basically. We also have a match seller who approaches Mr. Hyde and he hits her. And then we have a woman who is not in motion. She's actually in her house. She's looking out the window though, and she witnesses Mr. Hyde murder a man. So I was examining, how does gender work with this idea of motion through the city, and how women are constrained, and how in all of these instances these women try to be in motion in the book and they are like immediately shut down because Mr. Hyde violently does something. Even though the maid who witnesses the murder isn't the victim of the violence, she is seriously traumatized. So that's what I was doing with that paper. I really liked that paper. I was proud of myself with that one. Then for the tourism or Imperial Gothic paper, we were asked to investigate the relationship between travel and fear. And I chose to look at The Hound of the Baskervilles, and we had to use the tourism studies criticism to inform our reading. Why is fear an unavoidable or even desirable element of travel? How does the discourse of education and collection inform the character's understanding of foreign buildings and landscapes? I know that I wrote on The Hound of the Baskervilles. I don't remember this paper at all. So, I mean, as you can see, I had checked out by the end of this class, even though I loved it. The pandemic was rough. 3-hour Zoom sessions are hard, okay? Like, I was not having a great time at the end here. I'm gonna quickly see if I can find the paper. And I was actually looking at the Gothic as a touristic fabrication in the Hound of the Baskervilles. And I'll just read my thesis statement because I feel like that's the best way to give you a sense of it. Conan Doyle presents the Gothic as a touristic fabrication created both by the tourists' minds and by interpreters trying to fool the tourists. Like the reader of a Gothic novel, the tourists take pleasure in this constructed sense of dread and terror, but it dissipates the moment the construction becomes too real and results in horror. So here I was talking about how we've got Watson's depiction of what Dartmoor is like, kind of desolate, empty, but actually in reality it was a huge tourist spot and there would have been people like golfing. So again, I don't really remember a lot about this paper. I also know that it was not my best paper. I got A's on the previous 2 papers. This one got an A-. Again, kind of checked out there at the end. However, this was still one of my absolute favorite classes over the course of my degree. Of course, it was the one thing that I got to take that was really in my time period, so I was having a great time. I love Gothic literature. So I was just absolutely in my glory with this class, and I'm so glad that I got to take it. So that is what I read for my Victorian Gothic course. Let me know down in the comments below, have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Have you taken a Victorian studies class? What did you read for it? It has been great chatting with you. I will see you soon. Bye.